There we go. All right. So next up, we have Rob Desjardins, Communications Coordinator with the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research. He will be talking about crafting a clear and compelling description. And I'm actually just going to share my screen with his slides and take it away. Rob.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Amanda. And hi, everybody, today. My name is Rob Desjardins. I am a communications coordinator at FGSR, but this is a really cool opportunity for me today because I spent 10 years of my professional life actually as a graduate writing advisor in the Academic Success Center, working with graduate students on the project of research writing. It's fun and invigorating to be back at it today. I hope I'm not too rusty. It's been about a year and a half, but I'll do my best and hopefully we'll have some fun. So the task is developing an effective approach to writing an images of research description, which is really a genre of research writing. It's a lot like the kind of piece of writing that you would include at the beginning of a proposal, at the beginning of you know a chapter of your thesis. Potentially, if you're going up an elevator with somebody at a conference trying to describe the nub or the essence of your research project to them, the way that you tackle those tasks is actually going to be very similar to what you're doing here with your small miniature description of your research for viewers looking at your image. So it's a really useful task for us to sort of think through together, which I think will have multiple opportunities for you to apply it in other situations. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is when we talk about writing as a process, thing is developing an effective approach to any kind of research writing is something that's useful to talk about in the context of workshops like this, but it really isn't something you can pick up from a tip sheet or just sort of directly from a workshop. It's not like building a bookshelf. It's a process that you work through. One of the really important elements of the process is looking at and reading exemplars, reading other people's work, looking around to see how other people have tackled the same rhetorical, that is communication or writing task that you have to tackle in such a small space. I'm going to tell you, it's not an easy thing to do, probably not going to be an easy thing to do in a way that you feel completely satisfied with. It's going to take a few runs at it as you write your own. So I'm going to suggest that it's going to be a good idea for you to look around and check out other people's work, what some of the other IOR competitors have done in past years to see how they've tackled this task. And I'm going to suggest that instead of telling you how to do it, probably the best thing I could do is supply you with some good questions that you can ask. Okay, as you both encounter other people's work and think through your own. And there are going to be four. I hope this isn't too cutesy, but I've called them the nub, the flow, the hook, and the sound. Okay, so the nub is what should I say about my image? The flow is how should I organize the description? The hook is really important. What's the first thing I should say to my reader? When you're encountering a non-specialist who doesn't know anything about your research, may come from a completely different field, may not even be a university student, what can you say to them in your first sentence that's going to draw them into that description and make them want to learn more about your image? And fourth, what I call the sound, that is how to write clearly and concisely. That's a big subject too. So let's do our best. We'll go on to the first slide now, the nub. We could just switch the slide there, Lucinda. Great. So what should I say about my image? I guess a good first step in preparing a research summary for non-specialists, whether you're doing an IOR description or any such summary, is to ask two questions. What key points do I need to include in this description? And in what order should I place them? And those sound like painfully simple questions that a lot of us just tend to sort of jump over, grab the keyboard and start writing without really encountering those two questions first. But actually, the shorter your research description is, the more concise it has to be. And if there's anything that has to be concise, it's an IOR image description. Those questions actually become really important. They sound simple, but they become important to ask right at the beginning. So first of all, what should I say about my image? That is to say, out of the universe of various things that I could say about this image and about my research project, What should I choose to say? And if you think about it, potentially there are like a zillion things that you could possibly say. I've just listed about 8 of them here. A problem or question the research seeks to answer, a process or effect that the research examines, story or person that features in the research, the objective of the research project, how you conducted it, what is a key finding, 2 really important ones, potentially, how the image speaks to these issues or how the image was constructed. Now, here's the really important point about this list that I've put on this slide is number one, it's not exhaustive. There are lots of other things that you could potentially say. And number two, most important, I'm not suggesting that you should cover all of these things. Quite the opposite. This is a long list of from which you want to cull down just the very best, most essential things to say. You don't have a lot of space or time to devote to this. So you have to pick exactly the right ones. The challenge lies in deciding what to include. Less is more. So if we could switch slides there, Lucinda. So it's very important to be selective, very selective. And I would suggest that here are 3 things, here are 3 basic sort of principles or rules of thumb that you can carry with you when you decide out of that whole range of potential subject matter that you could bring into your description, what will allow you to choose the right things to say. Number one, is it compelling? Is something that you have to say about your research going to be meaningful to a non-specialist? We're talking here about writing for people who haven't spent the time with the work that you have never even seen it before. So is it going to be compelling and meaningful to them? Number 2, will it help them to understand your work? And here's number 3, the most important one. I probably should have put it as number 1. Is that potential component of your description relevant to the image? Does it bridge? Does it help somehow to bridge or to connect the world that you're showing in the image and the nature of your research? Okay, those are the 3 sort of key questions that you want to ask yourself. And I think, yeah, if we could, what I'd like to do is just take a few quick moments for us to do together as a group a kind of review of some exemplars of some what I think are really elegant, really effective descriptions that other people have submitted for IOR in the past. So yeah, if we could just scroll down to the description here. Yes, exactly. Honorable mention, Andres Camacho Alpizar. If you don't mind, I'm actually just going to spend a moment, since we've only got 25 minutes, I'm banking on the fact that you won't get sick of my voice in that time. So I'm going to spend a moment and just read this. So just sit back, listen to the description, and think about the sort of the components. There's about, I think it's about 8 sentences here. I'm going to suggest there's about 3 components, 3 moves or pieces, major pieces of information that this author has decided to include in his description based on A, what is relevant and meaningful to the reader, and B, what he has depicted in his image. Okay, so listen to the description and then we'll talk about why he might have chosen those particular elements. Okay. I love this first sentence, by the way. We're going to come back to first moves in a minute. This is a beautiful first sentence. How does a beaver build its dam? Honeybees their hive, or a bird its nest. We know of many examples of animal architecture occurring in nature, but we understand very little about how animals know what structure to build and how to build it. Much like we can assign certain buildings or structures to the artist or architect who created them, examining the design of different bird nests allows us to detect whether individual birds have unique birding styles. Thus, I aim to determine how birds develop their nest building behavior by investigating whether different individuals of the same species have different building styles. More specifically, I study the role that learning and genetics play in nest building, a behavior traditionally considered purely instinctual. The nests in this image were built by 5 different zebra finch males, the nest builder in this bird species. Each column shows 2 nests built by the same male, one using pink string and another using orange string. By looking at the picture, would you say each bird has its own style? Okay, now, for my money, we all have different tastes, different opinions. For my money, this is a really good, really elegant description. Often when I work with graduate student writers, and we're talking about ways that you can sort of look at a little piece of writing like this and start to take it apart in terms of what are the main components that the author has there. I like to suggest a technique called what I call the hamburger diagram, which is to take your pen and to draw, or maybe in the case of what we can do is take our pinky finger and sort of draw a circle in the air around a group of sentences that together comprise a kind of a component of what the author is talking about. So if we do that with this author, I think we come out with basically sort of three components. If you take your pinky and circle sentences 1 and 2, what we have there is a compelling research question. How does a beaver build its dam, honeybees, or hive, or bird its nest? We know of many examples of animal architecture occurring in nature, but we understand very little about how animals know what structure to build and how to build it. Those two sentences serve together as a unit that functions as a research problem, a question. And I think that is the sort of, if you want, the overarching, the high level research question that the little bit of research that this author is doing is going to help inform. It's a big picture question. And what's so nice about it is that it's very, very relatable, as I said, to non-specialist readers. It's intrinsically interesting. This person is blessed with a research project that when you talk about it in terms of how do beavers build their dams, that's intrinsically interesting. We can all really get into that. We can all find that intriguing. So he's chosen well to start with that. Then if we move on to the next unit, I would say that the next probably unit would go from sentence 3, much like we can assign certain buildings or structures to the artist and architect who created them, probably all the way down to that sentence that says, more specifically, I study the role that learning and genetics play in nest building, a behavior traditionally considered purely instinctual. So what the author in this case has done is he's chosen to move on to a narrower, more specific focus on his own research objectives. We're going to talk in a minute about how that second piece flows nicely from the first. But just think about it as why is it useful for him to put this here? And how does this benefit the reader who's trying to make sense of his image? Well, I think two things happen. Not only does this clarify specifically what this author is showing and working on and writing about. After all, he's not working just generally about how animals build their lairs. He has a very specific question. He's drawing us to that specific question. But what's nice too is he's also drawing us closer to what's in the image. He starts talking about birds and how they build nests specifically, and the genetic and individual dimensions of that. Okay, so there's this nice, in move number 2, there's this nice move toward the image. And then number 3, he explains how the items in the image speak to those objectives. And what I love is he's able to get in a little bonus point at the end there and actually engage the reader by asking them a question, a puzzle about what they can see in the image. So together, I think, I hope you'd agree, if we were in a workshop setting, we could kind of toss this back and forth verbally. But I think those are 3 really good choices for things that he could have said, or that he did say, from the universe of things he could have said. And by the way, folks, if we just back up, we think about some of the things he potentially could have said and chose not to include. There's a whole bunch of them, right? Like he doesn't talk about the specifics of his research method. He doesn't talk about the process by which birds build their nests. He doesn't offer an anecdote about like a particular bird, right? The sort of, I don't know, Andrew Lloyd Wright of the avian world. He doesn't do those things. Why? For the 2 reasons that number 1, they're not reflected in the image. They don't inform the image. And number 2, they might not be as accessible to the readers. Okay, so that's quite a challenge. Now, we probably don't need to go to this today, but the link that I have there at the bottom links to another example performances movement. I'll put it in the references at the end of these slides so that you can see it. That goes to show that sometimes an author, oh, there we go. Given the nature of this image, we have a write up here on this page in which the author has opted to talk about the research method and the method of putting together the image, because the nature of the image is such that it raises questions. I mean, all of those, the lines, the demarcations, the swirls on the image are about the research process. So in order to speak to the image, in that case, it makes sense to talk about the research process. Okay, so these are some of the things that you might want to consider when thinking through what do you choose. Next point, organizing the content, the flow. How should I organize my ideas? The fact of the matter is, I talked about Animal architecture, our first example, and I suggested that it's a very good set of contents. I think as we read through it, you could also sense that there was a good flow. One item, point A, led effectively to point B, which logically and fluidly connected to point C. There wasn't any jumping back and forth. It didn't feel redundant. There wasn't any point in the description. If you're like me, and I know nothing about animal architecture, but if you're like me, there was nothing in the description that made you go, oh, I'm kind of lost. What's the person talking about? It all just it's like it took me by the hand as a reader and it guided me through the steps. The thing is, unfortunately, there is no one way to do that either. But I would like to, if we could go back one more time, Lucinda, to that animal architecture, that first link at the top there, and talk about it one more time. If we think about that sequence of steps, there we go. That sequence of steps. What we have once again is a broad, big picture research question. The author's actual research project is not nearly as broad as that overall question. How do animals, construct architecture? How do they know what to build? That's a big picture question, a compelling big picture question. If we, the second step then, it affects what we call in writing studies the funnel. All right, so you've compelled the reader by something they can relate to on the big picture. Then you're drawing them in and narrowing them to the specifics of your own research project. Often it takes the form of a gap in the literature, something we don't know, and specifically what your specific purpose, the specific purpose of your research is. And then his third step relates that directly to what we as the reader see in the picture. So we go from big picture problem, specifics of research, what's in the picture. That's a really good strategy in the case of the research that is presented in the case of animal architecture. But keep in mind, it's not always the same solution for every situation. So one of the things that we'll recall from that image is that it's a picture of a bunch of little nests, 2 rows of little nests. What it's a picture of, what it represents in the image, is the outcome of the experiment. Okay, and as an outcome image, that's the sort of image, it's the sort of information that speaks to objectives and the overall purpose of the study. All right, if, for instance, this wasn't a picture of 10 little pieces of wood with nests on them, if it was a picture of one bird and it showed the swirls and marks of how that bird was constructing its nest, that would call for a very different kind of description, wouldn't it? It's not an outcomes oriented, it's not an objectives oriented image. It is a process oriented image. So if we go back to the slide there, Lucinda, thank you so much, by the way. Lucinda's like a champ for doing this. If we go to this image called transition at the bottom, it's another very nice, right. So this description, I won't read the whole description. We're running low on time, so I won't read the whole description for you. But what happens is this description tells the story of a research project. It begins by directing the viewer's attention to the image, right, which is mysterious and beautiful. So here we have an image that shows something going on. We don't know what. And the first move, the initial move in the description is to point our attention to, you are looking at a process, a limb being formed, all right? And then the next few sentences explain step by step the process that you are seeing occur in this slide. If I remember right from the description, it's this really interesting project about how stem cells change into different kinds of cells and eventually become bones. You have this process of cellular change being represented in this image. Well, the nature of the image is such that it talks to process. So in that case, some of the components of the description that you're going to want to include and the way that you're going to want to lay it out is exactly the opposite of the other image. It's to start with the image and say, you're seeing a process happen here. This occurs, then that occurs. And then in a kind of an inverted way, the description moves finally at the end to, here's what my research overall is all about. Okay,
Well, I
so
just give you the 5-minute warning. Sorry to
thanks,
interrupt.
Peggy. Nope, that's appreciated. Thank you very much. So a couple of things, folks, just as you're reading these exemplars, think about the different strategies you can have, both in terms of what you choose and how you organize the material. Given that we have 5 minutes left, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on the next point, which is the hook. What's the first thing that you should say? Now, for non-specialist readers, I can't emphasize enough how important your first sentence is. Okay. Even if most of your description is fairly clear, readers who come carte blanche to any sort of research description, the first thing they read is a make it or break it moment. You can say something in a way that compels them, gets them interested, makes them hooked, or you can say something in a way that causes them to stumble and feel like they're kind of in a fog. And that stumbling is almost guaranteed to prompt them to stop reading the description, especially if in the case of an images of research description, they're just reading it out of interest. They're not reading it because they're being paid to as a member of your thesis committee, right? So you really want to think about that first sentence and the first statement that you make about the hook. Don't feel that you have to do something gimmicky or cute or tricky in your first sentence, but think about crafting a first sentence. I would suggest it's not necessary, but I would suggest in most cases a good first sentence is short, because a shorter sentence has extra impact, it has extra emphasis, and it requires fewer cognitive resources on the part of the reader. They can process it quicker. Okay, so give them a short first sentence and say something that would resonate with something that they might be interested in. Don't need to go to this, Lucinda, but I'll just read it out. We go back to animal architecture. How does a beaver build its dam? Honeybees their hive, or a bird its nest. Okay, really interesting, powerful. We don't. It's the sort of question that the non-specialist goes, hey, I never really thought about that before. I might also throw in there that there's a really nice, elegant sort of symmetry between the three components that the author talks about. They give three. It's just a really, really well constructed first sentence.
2-minute warning.
You got it. Okay. So look at first sentences and choose first sentences that are going to be effective. And I've left to the end. I've sinned. I've committed a crime. I've left to the end one of the most challenging things of all, which is the sound on the next slide. How do we keep things clear? How can we write clearly? Let's skip over this slide. We won't bother going back to animal architecture. I would suggest that if you want a nice example of an author who's written really clearly, that same exemplar that we've been talking about is really good. Let's skip to the next slide, Lucinda, just while we have some time. I'm gonna do two things in the time remaining to us. Number one, I'm gonna tell you about one of the oldest and one of the best books that can help you as a writer think about ways to craft your sentences that make a greater impact on your readers. Okay. Strunk and White, or it's now Strunk and Brown, The Elements of Style. Click on that link, go to the library, pull down some of the suggestions from that book, and you'll find that it's absolutely, it's helpfully linked in there. And I think you'll find that that's, they will draw out and they will elaborate some more of the things that I'm gonna touch on here. With the 1 minute I have left, I will simply say, number one, find a way to say an idea using as few words as possible. That's almost always the best way to do it. Do not say due to the fact that, say because. Don't say in order to, just say to, all right? Number two, don't use pretentious language. If you have to use technical, scientific, or artistic language or critical theory language, you have to use it. But whenever you can for non-specialist readers, don't say facilitate, say allow. Find words that are simple, concrete, and effective. 3 and 4, the active voice means to construct sentences which have a concrete actor and an imaginable action. I often talk about this as Dick and Jane for academics. When I was little, this shows you how old I was, we read a grade 1 textbook called Dick and Jane. When we were learning to read, it would say, Jane walks, walk, Jane walk. Okay, that's a good model for academic writing. Jane walks rather than the perambulation of Jane is occurring. All right, find a simple, concrete way to put an actor in front of a verb. Okay, and number 4, watch for nominalizations. Rather than explain that, I'm going to recommend a great TED Ed video to you. If you Google zombie nouns, ZOMBIE nouns, it'll give you some great instruction on how to avoid nominalizations, which will help you clear up your text. Sorry, I'm about a minute over. Thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to questions in the Q&A.